Hey kids! Welcome to Stylus Realm Compositing Time thing. No real news from me. Toonboom has put out their own master controller script called the Interpolation Grid script. I haven't had a chance to look at it, but by all means, anybody who's interested in the master controller, take a look at the one that my friend Scripters put out, take a look at this one, see what works and what's good about it, and let me know if you're using them because I'm super interested in the new stuff coming out. I threw my back out this week, so if I look like at any time like I'm silently screaming, I am. So bear with me. I won't be doing any aerobics during this session. It's gonna be pouting and drinking my coffee. And I think that's it. I don't really have any new announcements right now. I'm thinking of cutting down to one video a week towards December because of the holidays. But I haven't figured, I don't know. I don't have a plan. We'll see. I just want to quickly point out which modules I'm using. I do talk about them and some of the options in there, but if you want to go in depth and read a little bit more on them, I want you to be able to look them up quickly. So the turbulent noise is the one that we're going to be using to get these caustic effects. There are a couple tutorials out there that have been done in the past on these, so it's good to get to know this one. The Grayscale, I'm using this one because it has a matte output. So you're able to take something like this caustic effect, which is a rendered thing, and say, I want to use this now as a matte. So we'll get into that as we go. The matte blur, this gives you some fun options for your mattes. So once this goes into this, it's now a matte, and you can put it into this, and now you can use it in various ways. You can also force your matte to be a different color. You can add a blur to it, invert your matte. Lots of fun little things in there to play with. So that's definitely one, if you're interested in compositing, that you should take some time to get to know. I'm using the cutter and the blur, which are pretty standard. Hopefully you know how to use those ones. And then the contrast, this one works just like a brightness contrast in your Photoshop or other softwares. You could turn up your darks, turn up your lights, things like that. So those are the modules that I'm going to be using to create this effect, which in the end looks a little something like this. So don't be scared. We'll go step by step. It'll be great. So I haven't done a lot of compositing stuff, but I think it's really fun to get into. I have done compositing in the studio in Harmony. It has a lot of tools that I think are really underutilized. So I'm just take a little look at the scene. I posted this out on my Twitter and stuff for those of you who are on there. Actually, I'll just put a rendered version of the thing here so that you can see what this looks like when it's animated in sort of a higher definition, because the ones I put on Instagram and stuff they're pretty washed out. So the inspiration for this piece, I wanted to do something with water. I knew that because I've been talking to a viewer a little bit about some of the water effects, and so I looked up Finding Nemo, and this is the scene I started from. So the little fish here are looking at the butt. So I thought this would be a good scene to approach some of these interesting effects. All right, so let me pause this because it's going to be easier for me to talk about the butt of Finding Nemo. Of course, go see a legit version of Finding Nemo because it's a really beautiful film. And Finding Dory, I think, is still on Netflix. And it's pretty cute, but it's a beautiful movie, of course, because Disney knows how to make some pretty stuff. So I created some of the little assets. I made a little boat in similar tones and a little chain. But what I really wanted to look at is some of these caustic effects. So this is something that is very difficult to do by hand in a traditional way. Of course, it is doable. There's ways to go about it, but it's certainly going to be very time consuming. So instead, what we do is we'll use a generated effect, and Harmony has a good tool that I'm going to show you to create these little ripply things. So I want you to look at this in layers. We have these little highlight ones here, these little more circular, smaller ones. And then we have these longer stripes of darker value and sort of a lighter value. And as that's the rolling waves. So you've got a little bit of chop creating this stuff. And then you've got the rolling waves, which are going to create a separate thing. So just look at this now, and I want you to look for those two things that are floating on top of each other. We've got the smaller caustic effects, and then we've got the actual waves there. We also have some ripples around the boat that are pretty subtle, and we've got these little flecks, and then we have light beams here, which might be a little bit hard to see. I'm not sure how well this render of a YouTube video is going to look, but we've got a bunch of different stuff here, and what we're going to do is just tackle them one by one. And this is the result that I got. The caustic effects here, I couldn't quite get the really tight stuff. I'm sure if I kept at it, I could probably figure out exactly how they figured out the effect there. But I think it was good enough for what we did. So we're going to take a quick look at the network. This is a process that can get very busy looking. It's just the nature of compositing. You build things up over time, and a lot of this stuff is simple. They're simple ideas. They're just stacked one on top of the other on top of the other, so it starts looking very busy. And there might even be places where I could consolidate some of this stuff, but I don't feel like that's an important step, because when you're in the compositing stage, nobody comes after you. This is the final stage of everything. So you can get away with having a little bit of a messy network. So I think the easiest thing to do is going to be to just deactivate this and then start creating a new one. So the first thing I did is just look at the background overall of the scene, and I came up with this. If you're looking to avoid, you don't need a really fancy painted background. Just a gradient is fine for getting the darks down here and so the lights up here. The next little guy I have is a boat. So I painted him in here, and there's nothing sneaky about this boat, of course, because it's 2D. You could just paint yourself in a boat, and I just painted it directly the colors that I wanted it to be for this scene. If you had a boat that you had to match, you could use a color scale maybe to bring it into more of the blues or greens, or you could actually have the bottom of the boat painted for this scene specifically. That's really up to you. I just painted it right in. Okay. The next thing I painted in, because we're just going to look at our actual physical assets, we'll call them, is I added a little bit of a shadow here to our boat. There you go. There's nothing sneaky here. It's just adding a drawing with a gradient, and then I put a blur module on it. So if I take off the blur, it fades out the edges and stuff. You could get more busy with this, but I don't feel like, I mean, it's small. It's not something that's going to make or break the scene, so I don't think that's too big. The next thing that is actually painted is the dust. So you could use a particle effect here. I think you'd get a nicer look. You could maybe get some random movement and stuff in here, or you could go about painting it in a more complex way. You could put 2 or 3 layers of dust that are moving in different directions. I just went with one simple layer that was very slowly floating downwards, and then I made it so that the visibility of them was kind of affected by some other things later. And then we've got our water ripples. So this is something I think I've talked about before, just creating some little ripples. There's nothing fancy going on. All right, so now let's get into some of the effects modules that I've used in here. The most important one is going to be the turbulent noise. I'm going to grab him and bring him down here. And you can only see this when you look at the render view. This is going to be something that might be a little bit painful if you have an older model PC. There is a preview render. We can just pop that in here. And now it's not going to render this stuff, but it will render this guy here. So that's a way that you can lighten your scene up if you are having a little bit of trouble. So I'm just going to pop some numbers on here. You can see as I type in these numbers, we're starting to get this generated effect. There are tons of different guys in here, different looks that you can get. So this small bump one is really good if you're doing like a water reflected onto a surface, or like the way that the water reflects onto the floor of the ocean, something like that. You might want to go with the small bumps and then play around down here with the second one. I'm not going to go through, this one's perfect if you have like a 70s dreamscape thing. You can have it animate all that stuff. So I'm not going to go through every single one of these. It's basically something that you can play around with and really learn how it works. What I will do instead is I will show you what each of them is set up to do. This one here, these like smaller caustic effects, if I open that up, that's using subscaling and then the fractional bone. The X and the Y, this talks about how high and how wide your thing is. So on our sort of blank one, I have them locked so that they're being changed at a 1-to-1 ratio. The bigger the number, the smaller your little effect is going to be. And you can separate it, and you can just turn it up one way, which is going to give you vertical stripes. So this is good for if you want some TV static, something like that. This is how I created the sunbeam effects, by having something that's only vertical. And then as you bring the horizontal along, it starts to mesh down. So the way you can think of it, so you have the X and then you have the Y. And when they're talking about frequency, they're talking about, you know, if you have a radio wave like this, something like that, that's the X frequency. And then the Y frequency goes like this. So when you have both of them, then it starts to kind of like mush together into this sort of thing. The offset, this is just a panning thing, so you could animate it moving along in the scene. I tend to use a peg. You can attach a peg to this, but that is available if you want to do it there. The evolution, this is where you can animate this effect in sort of a watery way. I don't know how the math works on these things. I really have more of a guess and check system. Not all the features work with every single one of these. So mostly I just stick to this evolution one. You can see how it animates here. The evolution frequency, like I'm not even sure what that does. I'm sure it works for some of them better than others. The complexity, this one is pretty great. So right now this is set to 1, so it has 1 level of complexity. If I put this to 2, then it's going to add a second layer of these little squiggly maboobers. And this works really great for the water, like the floor caustics. You can make your second one a little bit smaller so that it's not as vibrant, and you can set it to 3. So now you've got one that is super bold, one that's slightly less bold, and it gets progressively less bold as it gets smaller based on this number here. But usually you stick to kind of like 2 or 3 at the most. I'd probably stick to 2 if I was doing a water effect. You can put it up to 1 if you want them to be 1-to-1 ratio. And then when you evolve it, you can see how interesting patterns are happening there. How this is starting to look like water light, if that makes sense. I mean, you could just sit here and play with it and see what your effects start to look like. Or in the case of setting up something like taking a scene from Finding Nemo and trying it like that, you can try and guess what they did to get those things figured out. All right, so I know that's not a great tutorial on how that really works, but I think playing with it is really your best bet because there's so many different combinations there. The next module you need after the turbulent noise is the grayscale. So this is one that you don't see a lot. It's kind of a little sneaky one, and the important thing here is that it has a matte output. So by adding this below the turbulent noise, you're saying that we can use this as a matte. The turbulent noise in itself cannot be used as a matte. This is what our turbulent noise looks like. By adding the grayscale, you can use it as a matte, and it immediately changes what it looks like. The black is now transparency, and the white is just a white. So this is super useful because now we can apply it to a cutter if we want to. I'm going to grab a cutter here, and I'm going to use this as a mat for the cutter. I've just grabbed a big chunk of water here. This is what I want those things to be. This is the color I want my effect to look like. And I'm using this as a mask so that this water is only visible where there's white on here. So the next thing we want to do is put our water in perspective, because if we're looking at our guy over here, you can see that, you know, it's going to be bigger here and it's going to get gradually smaller over there. So as I said, you can throw a peg on here, and I've converted it to a 3D, enabled my 3D, and now I'm able to just tilt the water back to whatever I need. So if I tilt it all the way to 90 degrees, you can actually see this whole effect is like going way into the background and then wrapping around and coming back. So this could be a useful thing for you. You don't need 2 for one on top plane and bottom plane if using it for both surfaces. So now we've got those ripples. That's looking the way we want. The next thing is these waves cutting across this way. So what I did was create another turbulent noise to figure out that one. So let's deactivate this guy, duplicate our new turbulent noise. We're using simplex and fractional boning, and I just found that through trial and error, honestly. So I've also put a peg on this guy. This is what it looks like when it's just sitting there. And then I added this guy here. I put some like stretch on here. My x-axis is up to 2. So if I set that back to 1, it looks a little bit more like that. And I stretched it out. So you can use your peg to affect this here on your 3D peg. I can make them longer, or I can make them shorter. No, you don't need to do 100% of it mucking around in your turbulent noise thing. All right, so our turbulent noise right now is being cut through the background. It's not being faded out. And that's literally just because it's been rotated in Z-axis. See, so it can muck about and stuff. So what I'm going to do is just use a bitmap composite to flatten out my turbulent noise. And then I'm just going to use a regular old drawing here put in the front to force it to be at 0. So now it's flattening out these 3D things. And this is an easy way to force something that's 3D to flatten out. So what I'm going to do, look at our effect. So where we have these stripy ones going across, there's fewer of these light highlights here. So I'm going to use a cutter, and then you use this mat to cut my other turbulent noise. So I'm using a turbulent noise to cut a turbulent noise by using these grayscales to make them mattes. Now, as it animates along, these dark ripples are going to go across the surface of my other turbulent noise. And this guy's animated by his evolution here. So if I turn the evolution up really, really high, you're going to see how that stuff's being affected, getting that watery sort of feel. And then it's being cut by this guy who's going across. Cut through like that. So I'm just going to pop my boat into the front. You can keep it behind, but use it as a cutter as well. So here I'm going to use my boat to cut through that. And this way what I can do is put a transparency on it. Let's just say 10%. So that we're getting a little bit of light effects on our boat. So that's a judgment call. You can play a little bit around there, figuring exactly how you want this boat to read in the water. I think I'm fine with it just being in the front. It feels okay to me. And then I'm going to want these rings. That looks okay. And it looks kind of cool with all this stuff down here, but that's not really a realistic thing. So coming back over, my ripples here, I want them to have a little bit more variety in color, because right now this is just cutting into whatever the background is and displaying that. It's not actually putting out its own visual information. So I created a little setup for that, and there's nothing fancy about it. I'm going to take my turbulent noise in grayscale and I'm going to plug it in. This fade is, if I look at the drawing, I just use a gradient to say this is where I want this thing to be displayed, because I'm going to put it through some colors so that it's displaying these colors instead of just the background, and that way I can change where it's dark and where it's light. Put it in there. And it's not a huge difference. So here's without it, and then here is with it. So it's just giving it a little bit more darkness through the middle here by grabbing the color from this. And then it's using this fade here to say that you're only visible in this bar of an area, because I just wanted to have sort of a shadowy area in here. Without this, you can see it's much more dramatic. But by putting in that little gradient fade, then it's only going to affect that little area. And it might seem like not a big deal, but it's the little things that really make this look nice. See, now it just feels more like, because with the rolling hills, you're actually getting shadows from the rolls in the ocean, so that you're going to get some little shadows there from those ocean rolls. And these rolls are just panned. They're not actually using an evolution or anything. I just pan them across the screen. All right, so we've got all that jazz. We went from that to now this. The next thing we're going to do is just fade all that. So we don't want all these super big caustic effects down here. So we're going to put a cutter, and then just, again, we're just using a gradient here that fades out into a transparency. And that's going to cut all that stuff out of the bottom and just leave us with their top stuff. So pretty. So even though this is getting unwieldy, I hope that you can see that it's really just a process. You just take one step at a time. You're like, okay, so I need these little ripples. How do I do that? Then you put it into perspective. You do the same process with your next effect, this ripply guy across here, and then you fade it out. So even though you've got a ton of little cutters in here that are determining how this stuff works out, it's really just a one step in front of the other thing. And it looks really scary, but you know, you just a little bit at a time. Don't overthink it. The next thing we're going to look at is these sunbeams. All right, so here's our sunbeam. Let's just take it in pieces. We'll start with our dealie there. So I used the purlin and the fractional bone in. I don't know how to say any of this stuff, but I just put the X up real high. You're gonna muck around with it and play there, see exactly what you want, just how many sunbeams you want, the variety. But you can also use a peg to stretch and squash that until it looks nice to you. And this stuff I left pretty much alone. I just wanted these guys here. And then I've had the evolution animated, and I put some animation here on the evolution, this guy down here, which is mostly where you're gonna animate these guys, so that you're getting a little bit of this sort of stuff going. This is a scientific term I use for sunbeams. Here I did put a peg on so I could affect the size of them, because I wanted to be relatively large. I didn't want like a million little sunbeams, but that's really what, I mean, you could decide for yourself what you think a sunbeam should look like, how many you should have in there. And then I put a quad map on there. So that way I was able to make them wider down here and more narrow up here. Boop. And you can do that quite a bit more, whatever you feel is right, whatever way you want your sunbeams coming. Boop. Next, what I'm going to do is use a matte blur. Now this guy's super convenient. Basically what this does is you can use this thing to tell any matte what color you want it to be. You can also add blurs and different fun stuff in here. You can invert your matte. So here you can see where there's white, there's now black, where there's black, there's now white. You can use the matte color. So if you already got a matte color that you want, you can just tell it to keep using that. You can multiplicative it. So this works a little better if you're not using like, because right now I have like green on green on green on green. So you're not going to see much of the multiplicative effect. But if you're using various colors, it'll work a little bit more like an overlay layer in Photoshop where you get a little bit of that background color behind. So that's certainly a fun thing to play around with while you're compositing. And you can turn your intensity up. I don't know why you'd want to in this case, but the real important thing down here is that I can take my highlights and I can make them whatever color I want. So I can do pink highlights or blue highlights. Here I've gone a little bit farther away from the green, more of a blue looking highlight, but you can just tell your sunbeam to be a color. I think it'd be great if the matte blur had a matte output button. That'd be cool, but we can just stack them. We have various things we can do here. Okay, the next thing, I don't want my guys to be as blurry down here. So I just put a little fade on there. And again, this is something that you can just eyeball. Do you want your highlights to come down that far? Do you want them to come down that far? We can figure out if we want this to affect, how we want this to affect our boat. And maybe we want to bring our boat shadow in front of that, just so it's still a little bit punchy there. So that's it behind. I like it. I think it's more dramatic in front, so we're gonna leave that in front. Like we can see that this is feeling close to finished. And what I wanted to do is these little specks. Right now there's just a whole pile of little specks that are kind of slowly drifting downwards. What I want to do is when they're in the sunbeams, I want them to be more visible. And when they're out of the sunbeams, I want them to be a little bit more invisible so that they're reacting to the light. Here's our dust up here. Let's bring him up to the front. And I'm going to use our sunbeam before it gets cut itself. I'm going to use that as a cutter. So now you're getting a little bit of subtle where the light is. You're getting more of these guys, but there's not a huge effect. So what I did is I grabbed a contrast node. You can turn up your black by your dark pixel adjust, or you can turn up your white. So what I did is I just blasted out the darks so that my cutters would be more confident here. And I threw a glow on our light beams. So here our light, it's feeling all right. Like this feels nice, but it feels like it's a cloudy day out there. So if we throw this back there, you're getting a lot more backlighting on your ripples by putting a glow here on those sunbeams. And the last thing I wanted to do once I got here, let's look at this other one, is I wanted there to be kind of a sunlight area here. So if you remember when we first set up these little water bits, we used this guy here as our watercolor, this really vibrant sort of green, and that's giving us this color. So what I did was I added a light, but it's just a circular gradient or radial gradient that's very white in the center and goes out into a transparency. And then I added a glow. So now I can turn up the intensity, turn down the intensity of that one area to give it a sort of a sunspot. So it's a subtle difference between that and that. But I mean, that's what compositing is all about, is getting those subtle differences, right? And there we go. If you follow along step by step, you should have this underwater scene. The downside is, of course, as you're creating this, you're kind of guessing, and then you have to render out a version in order to see how well it's doing. All right, so that's it. Thanks for tagging along on what I guess was kind of a long journey. At the end of the day, when you're thinking about compositing, just remember that's a process. So start with one piece, figure out how that came about, then work on the next piece. And don't worry too much if your network gets a little bit messy. You're the last person in the pipeline. That's fine. So nobody's going to deal with it after you. So you get a little bit of a free pass on that one. I have done little bits and pieces of compositing in the past, but if you're interested in more stuff like this, by all means, let me know, or let me know if you want other tutorials on the techno-geekery of this. This should be good for any version back, even I think we were doing this in 12. You don't need new stuff. And that's it. So like, share, subscribe, all those things internet people ask you to do, and I will see you in the next video.